They identified a very large geometrical chamber, about 15 feet beneath the forepaws of the Sphinx. I think there's a lot more remains to be discovered under the Giza Plateau. He said that the Hall of Records of Atlantis lay beneath the paws of the Great Sphinx. The reasons that I would never seek to divorce the ancient Egyptians from the Great Pyramids there are several reasons, actually. But first and foremost, I have no doubt that the ancient Egyptians were involved in completing the Great Pyramids, and there's 4 reasons for that. And that is the shafts, the so-called air shafts, that cut through the body of the Great Pyramid. They're very small. They're about that wide, that high. There are 2 of them in the so-called King's Chamber, one on the north wall, one on the south wall. And they always exited on the outside of the pyramid. And that was known back into the 19th century. 19th century explorers could actually climb the Great Pyramid and roll a cannonball into one of those shafts, and it would end up in the King's Chamber. So obviously they were connected. The shafts in the so-called Queen's Chamber, and I use the word so-called because we actually don't know what these chambers were for. No burial of any pharaoh was ever found inside the Great Pyramid. The so-called Queen's Chamber, the shafts don't exit on the outside of the Great Pyramid, and nor until 1872 were they visible within the Queen's Chamber itself. They'd been closed off with little facing blocks. You couldn't see that they were there. But one researcher went around tapping on the walls. He thought, there's shafts upstairs in the King's Chamber. Maybe there are here. And he found 2 hollow points, one on the north wall, one on the south wall, broke them open, and lo and behold, there were the concealed shafts. Now, the thing about those shafts is that all 4 of them point at key stars, one of them being the lowest of the 3 stars of Orion's belt. In the position in the sky that they occupied around 2,500 BC, not 12,500 years ago, but 4,500 years ago. And that astronomical connection to the stars at that time says to me, we cannot divorce the ancient Egyptians from the Great Pyramid. But then there's a problem. The ground pattern on the 3 pyramids on the ground reflects the pattern of Orion's belt itself. And this is, of course, no accident within the ancient Egyptian system, because the constellation of Orion was seen as the celestial image of the god Osiris, the civilization bringer, the entity who went around the world teaching civilization. That is who Osiris is, and he is seen in the sky. His image is seen in the sky as the constellation of Orion, and one of those shafts points at Orion's belt, and another one points at Sirius, and 2 of them point at the circumpolar stars. At the time when Egyptologists believed the pyramids were built. So there's definitely a connection, and I wouldn't seek to break it. But the problem is that the pattern of the 3 pyramids on the ground is the pattern of the 3 stars of the belt of Orion. And this has also changed subtly over the ages as a result of precession. So although the shafts in the Great Pyramid lock that monument to the epoch of 2,500 BC, the pattern of the pyramids on the ground reflecting Orion's belt, effectively, it's like you want to make a painting of Orion's belt. You paint it on an easel and then you lay it down flat in front of you. That's what you have on the Giza Plateau. They reflect the pattern of Orion's belt and its relationship to the Milky Way. The Great Pyramids and their relationship to the River Nile reflect the sky of 12,500 years ago, not 4,500 years ago. A very complicated situation here. Ground pattern, speaking of what the ancient Egyptians called Zep-Tepi the first time, 12,500 plus years ago, and the star shafts connecting also to the time of the ancient Egyptians themselves. So no wonder it's a difficult monument to figure out, but it speaks to both epochs. We could say that the ancient Egyptians themselves had a sufficiently advanced knowledge of precession to be able to visualize the skies of 8,000 years previously. That would be a perfectly reasonable thing to say. But then we're confronted with the problem of the Sphinx. I mentioned that lion-bodied monument. That lion monument that I believe stood there 12,500 years ago, looking at the rising sun when it was housed by the constellation of Leo. That lion monument has been subjected to thousands of years of erosion. And I want to pay tribute to the brilliant work of 2 individuals. The late, great John Anthony West, dear friend of mine, the first to raise the possibility that the Great Sphinx had been subjected to some kind of water weathering, and that creates a problem in itself, because 4,500 years ago, the Giza Plateau was as dry and as waterless as it is today. And then Professor Robert Schoch from Boston University, and kudos to Robert Schoch, putting his reputation as an established academic on the line and looking at the geology of that site and coming to the conclusion and publishing the conclusion that the Great Sphinx was subjected to about 1,000 years of extremely heavy rainfall. Not a flood, but precipitation, rainfall coming from above, selectively hollowing out the softer areas of rock and leaving the harder areas of rock in place. And it's that precipitation-induced weathering that you see more in the trench around the Great Sphinx now than you see on the Sphinx itself, because the Sphinx has been constantly restored. This is one of the anomalies. We know that some of the restoration blocks were put there in the time of the pharaoh who's supposed to have been responsible for the Sphinx, and not a single document tells us that he was responsible. That's just another Egyptological fantasy, actually. The Great Sphinx was subjected to about 1,000 years of heavy rainfall, and that's the only time you find that heavy rainfall on the Giza Plateau is the Younger Dryas. Between roughly 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. You certainly didn't find it 4,500 years ago when the Sphinx is supposed to have been made. So we're looking at a very old monument, very heavily eroded. In the time of the ancient Egyptians, they looked at that massive leonine head, which was so damaged and so eroded, almost unrecognizable, and they recarved what was left of it into the head of a human being, wearing the Nemes headdress of an Egyptian pharaoh. That is a recarving of a much more ancient monument. That's a restoration work that was done on it. And we don't know which pharaoh it's supposed to represent. Egyptologists like to think that it represents Khafre. There's no compelling evidence for that whatsoever. So a lion-bodied monument, once a lion-headed monument, that now takes the form of the lion-bodied Great Sphinx with a recarved human head that's way out of proportion to the scale of the rest of the body of that 270-foot-long monument. The head is sort of tiny by comparison with the rest of the body. And the ancient Egyptians didn't get things out of proportion unless there was a very good reason to do so. And I think they were restoring a very damaged and much older leonine head.
Is there not a hidden chamber as well under the Sphinx?
Yes. While work was allowed to be done, John Anthony West and Robert Schoch were both involved in this work back in 1992. They did a seismic survey around the Sphinx, and they identified a very large geometrical chamber, about 15 feet beneath the forepaws of the Sphinx. Could be a natural cavity, but the rectangular form of it suggests strongly that human beings
was dug out or something.
Yeah, that it was made. And in fact, there is a whole underworld at Giza. This is beginning to be recognized. The so-called Tomb of Osiris is an example of this. That subterranean chamber beneath the Great Pyramid is an example of this. I think there's a lot more remains to be discovered under the Giza Plateau. What is needed is seismic tomography, and that will show you a picture of what is underneath the Giza Plateau. And whenever that's been done, it's identified chambers, passageways, corridors, and not enough is being said about this. I think they're just so locked into their paradigm that they can't see what's there.
They feel like they've got it figured out.
They've got it figured out.
No reason to waste resources.
Exactly. No reason to waste the resources, and they don't want to get mixed up in any way with this crowd of kind of quote-unquote New Age thinkers like Graham Hancock. Edgar Cayce was a healer. He used to fall into a trance-like state. And in that trance-like state, primarily what he did was offer remedies for people's ailments.
Yeah.
But from time to time, he would start talking about Atlantis and about the lost civilization of prehistoric antiquity. And he said that the Hall of Records of Atlantis lay beneath the paws of the Great Sphinx. Well, immediately for scientifically minded Egyptologists, this is something to get as far away from as possible.
Right.
Yeah.
So they kind of neglect the fact that there are ancient Egyptian texts that speak precisely of that. Precisely of a Hall of Record. Edgar Cayce didn't know about those texts. He was tapping in from some other realm into this, but that's one of the reasons that Egyptologists have distanced themselves so much from the notion that there might be something hidden there. Oddly enough, both Mark Lehner, who is the leading American Egyptologist doing work around the Great Sphinx and on the Giza Plateau, and Zahi Hawass, who's the leading Egyptian Egyptologist doing work around the Giza Plateau, both of them were sent through college by the Edgar Cayce Foundation. Wow. Robert Bauval and I published this in our 1996 book, The Message of the Sphinx. It was published in America as The Message of the Sphinx and in Britain as Keeper of Genesis, and we documented this. It's all there if anybody wants to check it out. Very rapidly afterwards, they distanced themselves completely from the Edgar Cayce organization, but until quite recently, Zahi Hawass was still giving lectures at the Edgar Cayce Foundation, while at the same time insisting that he had nothing to do with any of these so-called crazy idea.
The Great Pyramid of Giza is probably the most stunning of all these ancient structures. And the stones are immense, and some of them were cut from a quarry that's hundreds of miles away. How do you think they did that?
Well, some of them, the granite in the Great Pyramid comes from more than 500 miles to the south. If you look at the famous King's Chamber, its walls and its roof are, the ceiling of the King's Chamber are all made with gigantic granite blocks.
Stunning detail.
Stunning detail. Those blocks on the roof of the King's Chamber weigh 70 tons each. Now, Egyptologists will tell you that, they could move heavy blocks because they put them on wet sand and they push them along on wet sand. Well, maybe if you're just at ground level, that will do. But when you're 350 feet above the ground, as you are in the King's Chamber, that won't do at all. I don't know how they did it. All I know is they did it. I don't think anybody knows how they did it, how they lifted those stones, how they brought them up to that level. I think we're looking, again, at a lost technology. I also think that, there are huge corporations that have very large investments in a particular path of technology, which is ours.
Right.
And for somebody to come up with a whole new path of technology, very threatening to them, and much better from their point of view to suppress it, or if they can't suppress it, to kind of buy it and hide it, and keep things on the track that they're on now. I would say that's the motive.
And maybe for people that are curious about this and maybe even skeptical, consider the massive change that nuclear power provided us. Mm-hmm. Whereas before the 1940s, this was unheard of.
Yeah.
This even the concept of it. And all of a sudden, now we have nuclear power, nuclear weapons, the most profound power known to man currently.
God help us, it's a power for use by adults, but unfortunately, it's delinquent children who are leading our world right now. The leaders of our planet, the politicians out there, they're just complete arseholes. I can't think of any of them who I feel any respect for whatsoever. And it's they who are in charge of this frightening, terrifying technology. We just aren't mature enough as a civilization